From Geppetto Studios in New Freedom, Pennsylvania, welcome to the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast, your home for inclusive, positive geek culture, where we talk about movies, comics, music, books, and whatever else we feel like. Please welcome your host,
was such nonsense,
Brad Mendenhall.
Hey kids, it is episode 280 of the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast. I am thrilled to have Dr. Anna Peppard, one of my favorite guests, return to the program to discuss iconic comic book couples. Anywho, for the first time in a while, Katie has a question.
What superpower would you not want?
Shush, dog. Judge Martin Boomer apparently has a lot of thoughts on this. This is actually something I've... Shush! Shush! I'm talking. This is actually something I believe I referenced during my conversation with Dr. Anna Peppard. The Human Torch has really useless powers, especially in the context of he's a hero that when he fights bad guys, he's not trying to hurt anybody. So he has a power where he can throw fire, and he doesn't want to burn anybody. So you end up, he's one of the heroes that he sort of flies around, and if he's lucky, there's Doombots to fight, but otherwise he just sort of throws fire and doesn't hurt anybody. Not that long ago, there was an issue with Spider-Man where Human Torch was angry at Spider-Man, and as comic book characters tend to do, they had a superhero fight where you had the Human Torch flying after Spider-Man and throwing fireballs at him because he was mad. But you knew that he wasn't trying to hurt Spider-Man. All Spider-Man had to do was just stand there and, wait for Human Torch to, realize he couldn't do anything. Human Torch is sadly become a pretty useless character. The writers have to do a whole lot to find ways to make him, make his powers work in different stories, and often and I've referenced this before, he's one of the characters, him, Black Knight, sometimes the Monica Rambeau Captain Marvel, where all he does is sort of fly or run around in the background because he actually can't do anything. So, the Human Torch and his flame powers. Very excited. It has been way too long. And returning to the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast as a proper guest in a first time in a while, Dr. Anna Peppard. Doc, how you doing?
I'm doing okay, hanging in there. Wrapped up the spring semester, getting to take a little bit of a breather now while still somehow having entirely too much to do, but always happy to jump on a podcast and chat about my favorite topics with my friends.
I'm always looking for a reason to have you back on. Not that long ago, and the news has actually gotten weirder since I first threw this idea at you, because a while back it sort of made the news in the world of comics, and it's actually weird that comic book stories make news anymore, because it's always about what film news about our favorite comics. But there was a little bit of controversy, sort of blew up on comics Twitter. Peter Parker, the Amazing Spider-Man, was getting engaged in another relationship with Black Cat, and they showed pages from this all over, and people were sort of irritated about it, where Black Cat says, "What about Mary Jane?" And he said, "Well, Mary Jane, I always love her, but it's more like the love with a brother and sister," which, ooh. And then I reached out to you because I wanted to talk about, there are some iconic couples in comics. And for the last 30 years, Peter Parker and Mary Jane have been one of them. So I figured, let's talk about this. But then it gets weirder because in Amazing Spider-Man, they've done a time jump, and now somehow Mary Jane is married to a guy named Paul, and has 2 kids. And it's not an unusual thing in comics or pop culture. The whole, oh, we've gone X amount of time into the future and letting the reader try to figure it out. So now they've really gone very far to, again, break up this couple. They've done it a couple times, most notoriously the One More Day story where they had Pete and Mary Jane sell their marriage to the devil to keep Aunt May alive. A rightfully despised storyline. I don't know. How much have you been keeping up on this?
Well, it's so funny. Like, I feel like between the time at which you asked me to do this because of that being the prompt and like this week, where I was like, oh, this is like 3 comic book Spider-Man fan scandals have happened since then. Because I mean, the thing this week was the announcement of a Death of Kamala Khan story arc in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man. So people are very upset about that right now. But all connected to the same storyline that you're talking about. So there's been a lot of vitriol among comic fans on Twitter about that.
And it's funny, you bring that up, and I responded to that. I don't respond to stuff, just how much I hate it. And not because I hate death in comics stuff, what it's become, because you just know it's crap. And I've read comics a long time, and I know death has never really meant... We act like it's something that started with Superman, the death of Superman. Characters died and came back all the time. But it's really bothersome when they make it this big production. Oh, Kamala Khan dies, or, the death of Wolverine, the death of Superman, the death of Batman, the death of Spider... this has happened so many times, and you just... When they're acting like it's a big deal and the characters, and it's just going to be undone within a handful of months or weeks or whatever it's going to be. It wasn't like when I was reading comics, I remember the Viper, reading an issue of Captain America where the Viper gets exploded. And she came back later, but it was a thing where they made it a little ambiguous, and also it was a thing where they killed her off and they were probably planning on keeping her dead until another writer had an idea for a story with the Viper. And that feels a little different, but it just feels so disingenuous. That's what the death of Kamala Khan represents.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of issues bound up with it. I mean, I think, especially the way, I mean, we're getting really off topic super fast, but I mean, the way it was marketed to, where it was sort of like, a bunch of white characters, especially like white men, sort of having feelings about the death of this brown girl. And it's sort of like, there's a bad trope about killing sort of, black and brown characters to motivate white men's feelings, much as there's a trope about killing female characters to motivate white men's feelings. So I think a lot of people were reacting to that aspect of it as well. So yeah, just that announcement didn't hit well with a lot of people for a variety of reasons.
Well, especially white characters who had nothing to do with Kamala Khan.
Yeah, it's not really her supporting cast. She sort of becomes a symbol for the feelings of those characters, and yeah, it's just a little bit something.
Going back to, these comic book iconic couples, and you think of, when you think of that, who do you think of as the mega couple, iconic couple in comics?
Well, I mean, you have to go Superman and Lois. I mean, first superhero, first love triangle in superhero comics between Superman and Clark and Lois. I mean, in terms of Marvel Comics, the fact that Reed Richards and Sue Storm had the first superhero wedding. I mean, I think about kind of those 2 sets of characters as being representative of those tropes in their 2 respective superhero universes. But I don't know, who do you think of? Who are you interested in talking about?
No, you're definitely right. It's Superman and Lois, because it was such a neat dynamic where it was a love triangle between Superman, Clark Kent, and Lois Lane. So Lois pined for Superman and Clark pined for Lois, and just the inherent ridiculousness of that. I never think of Reed and Sue in that way. Possibly because there isn't that much tension there. it was never really presented as this will they, won't they, or this love triangle. Namor pops up every now and then, and they tinker with that story. But it's still really the story of the Fantastic Four is a family. So it's Reed and Sue are the happy married couple. He pays too much attention to work, and she always wants more attention, and they take care of their surrogate children of Johnny and Ben, and then their real children. Which shows the difference between Marvel and DC a lot of times. Where would you put, in the hierarchy of those couples, where would you put Peter and Mary Jane?
I mean, it's a couple that a ton of people have a lot of affection for very good reasons. It's a couple I've enjoyed in comics over the years. I mean, we're talking about different things when we talk about every type of superhero couple, right? Like, there are types of superhero couples where it's two superheroes who are in a couple, which, Reed and Sue are. And there's a number of superhero couples like that, like both gay and straight couples, sort of all along the spectrum. And those kind of relationships intrigue me in a certain way. The kind of like quote unquote civilian superhero relationship intrigues me in a certain way. But I don't know. I mean, maybe we could talk about like the concept of these kinds of relationships and like why there ends up being a tension in this space of like, can these kind of relationships exist long term in this space that sells a certain kind of predominantly masculine fantasy? And there sometimes is a lot of anxiety about incorporating a certain type of domesticity into that space. And how does that change the genre? How does that change the audience? And a lot of those anxieties have a lot to do with why these iconic superhero couples often get broken up. A lot of discussion around that in the New 52 relaunch from DC way back when, about we got to split up all these marriages because we're not going to be able to appeal to this, ostensible younger demographic that doesn't actually read comics. So it's very, very silly. But this ostensible younger demographic who doesn't want to read these stories about boring old married couples. They want to read stories about young independent men, like having all of these flirtations with like other sexy superhero ladies and not coming home to one lady every night. And like, I don't know, I always find those questions really fascinating in terms of how people respond to these relationships in these spaces.
Well, it is really funny where a lot of those, well, and I started reading comics in the 80s. The big superhero couples, Vision and Scarlet Witch, Hawkeye and Mockingbird. And I love the banter between Hawkeye and Mockingbird. And then Pete and Mary Jane. It was funny. The first comic book I ever read was the issue of Amazing Spider-Man where Mary Jane revealed that she knew Peter Parker had been Spider-Man basically since the beginning. A lot of these are couples that haven't been together. It's funny, you think of Vision and Scarlet Witch as a unit, and you and I talked about this when the WandaVision show came out. They have been split up longer than they were together by this point.
At this point, yeah.
And you still think of them as a unit. But they really haven't been. Same thing with Hawkeye and Mockingbird, where they were together in West Coast Avengers. Eventually, right before John Byrne taking over the series, they got them separated. They had sort of a will they, won't they. They killed off Mockingbird. She was dead for decades, for 15, 20 years, and then they brought her back, and they were sort of trying to do, they had a series with the two of them. It didn't really catch on, and both characters have sort of gone off in their own directions. I think they, every now and then, have them intermingle. But heck, and something you alluded to, they actually had Mockingbird together with Spider-Man for a period of time, which I wanted to like more than I did, because I like that character. I like the Mockingbird character, where you have somebody who, what I always thought was she was, the idea is like she was somebody who was like a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent and really sort of a professional spy, who was in the world of superheroes, and she was a little overmatched, but she was smarter and clever and more strategic than most of the other characters, so she was able to sort of hang with the other characters, and I thought that would work. And the dynamic of Spider-Man, who, Peter Parker, who's always sort of like, has crappy luck and gets himself into a lot of trouble because he doesn't think things through, and somebody who's uber professional and knows what she's doing. That's like, that could be fun. It sort of worked, but it is funny, and it shows there's sort of, I think comics sort of miss on that, where they seem so invested in splitting these characters up, and it should be telling, hey, people obviously like Vision and Scarlet Witch together because when they're when you have the cinematic versions of the character, they get them together right away, and people love it. And find Vision and Scarlet Witch in the movies more interesting as a couple than they did as individual. Like, those characters were much more interesting in WandaVision and even the scenes they had together in Infinity War than they ever were in Age of Ultron, where they were just sort of separate characters who had sort of vaguely defined powers.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think it speaks to sort of the sliding scale of fan memory in terms of superhero comics, because, I mean, we're talking about characters with, like, 50, 60, even 70-year histories now, right? But the most iconic version of the character tends to take up greater space in the fan imaginary. So, even though the Hawkeye Mockingbird relationship technically is not like a long thing, it still takes up a lot of space in the fan imaginary, right? And same with something like Vision and the Scarlet Witch. I mean, you get some of the comics that those characters starred in kind of being canonized in the fan imaginary. I mean, that whole Bronze Age Avengers run, their will they or won't they relationship was so central to that run. I mean, Vision was like the character in the corner box for a lot of that run. And so to the extent that people have a nostalgia for that run, those characters are very much in the center of it, right? And I think just some later comics, there isn't that same intense nostalgia for whatever reason. So it just ends up taking up space for people, and people still want to see those quote unquote classic storylines sort of come back. I mean, it's funny, as soon as enough time has passed, storylines become classic and then we can kind of do them as pastiche again. I don't know what the exact time frame is for that, like 20 years maybe, and then they start becoming classic.
Spider-Man's an interesting case where before Mary Jane, and even when he was dating even before he was dating Mary Jane, that period of time where she had returned from being written out of the series for a few years, came back, and she knew that he was Spider-Man. They couldn't be together because she knew he was Spider-Man. Even up to that point, like, the love of Peter's life was often identified as Gwen Stacy. There's a thing where a lot of people, I think, had trouble buying into the relationship a lot because the death of Gwen Stacy was seen as such a big part of, and him losing the love of his life. Really, one of the first really well-known cases of a character getting fridged before it became such a cliche, and it had a more emotional impact. So I'm sure for a lot of fans who maybe read those 50s or 60s comics, I guess more 60s comics, like Mary Jane was, the sort of felt second place to a lot of them, had a good way. They haven't found a good, and maybe it would be easier to move on from this. First off, if they would really pull the trigger on, no, Mary Jane and Peter just aren't going to be in a relationship. Every time you feel like that, they keep bringing her back, and they're trying to do the will they, won't they thing again, while putting more and more ridiculous barriers in between them. And then they just also keep bringing back Black Cat, who seems like the only other, and I know what it is. I think it's a thing of some writers and editors or whoever might have started reading comics when Black Cat was I started reading comics when I was 10. Black Cat in the first issue was Spider-Man's girlfriend. You end up getting your first comic book crush, and a lot of the characters, I think writers just want to write Black Cat, and they like that relationship. But it's been so long since you've had, other than Black Cat, it's been so long since they've had a Spider-Man girlfriend or Peter Parker girlfriend that anybody really liked that could become iconic like that.
So so much of this need for drama too. I mean, it's the space that we're in. The superhero comics are pulpy and dramatic and corny and exaggerated, and that's what we're here for. So that's part of it. But I mean, it's also, they're still on this publishing model where, I mean, Spider-Man often comes out twice a month and it's an ongoing story. There's many Spider-Man titles every month still. And you got to have something that is going to be quote unquote newsworthy. And these days, what quote unquote newsworthy tends to mean is like a tweetable panel, right? I mean, something that is distilled into a shocking moment that you're hoping fans will tweet, and that discourse will happen whether it's good or bad. And it's been interesting to me watching how comic book fandom has sort of been affected by the rise of social media. I think it's been great in so many ways. I mean, my Twitter is like 80% queer X-Men fans. I love it. Love having space in that community, which I didn't have, 15 years ago when I was reading comics. But on the other hand, it does feed into this thing that comics were already doing about generating controversy, right? And so something like this death of Kamala Khan thing from this week, I mean, I know there was a thing where it was kind of leaked early by Entertainment Weekly, presumably because one of the comic book sites was going to leak it, so Marvel told Entertainment Weekly they could run with it a day early. And I mean, again, everything on my Twitter is comic book stuff. So every second tweet on my Twitter, like yesterday, was the Kamala Khan stuff. I mean, it got a lot of traction, like most of it negative on my feed, but still, these things do get traction. And in an industry that's shrinking all the time, I mean, comics in general are getting more popular, but superhero comics are not getting more popular and haven't for a very long time. They rely on this stuff, and it's maybe not creatively beneficial for this medium to still be relying on those old publishing structures and trying to make them work. And that's a big conversation about, should superhero comics still be doing this weekly publishing thing? Should they still be doing the comic book store thing? What are we going to do about digital comics? The digital comics sort of marketplace has really collapsed in the last couple of years. And so I don't know. I don't know what kind of the solution is to that, but in terms of there being shocking twists and there always having to be, ways to interfere with these characters being happy. I mean, of course it's all part of that, right? It's all part of the way that these stories are sold.
And it's so difficult because the stories are always so big, and because everything has to be part of an event, you become numb to it. So when everything's an event, nothing's an event. I remember the death of Superman. It was a big story. And, in retrospect, Doomsday is a lousy character. But everyone bought that, and everyone was excited and theoretically, and I guess it kind of worked because you created, the whole thing is they created former characters who were versions of Superman. That Superboy, the Connor Kent Superboy, the Steel, and then you had Eradicator or Vindicator, or was it Eradicator? Yeah, Eradicator. Vindicator was the Alpha Flight.
I started buying comics right when that whole storyline was going on, and I specifically started buying them because I was trying to get into Superman, because I was into the Lois and Clark TV show, and oh boy, that was a real bad time for a 12-year-old girl who'd never read comics before to try to figure. To this day, I don't understand the whole death of Superman storyline. It's lost to me. I'm not going back.
It's terrible. Because some big problem with the death of Superman was, and it's a thing that happens when they do these death things, the writers want to write a story where it's fairly obvious that guy is dead. Superman was really, really dead. Then the way they brought him back was such nonsense. Just the same as the death of Wolverine was such nonsense. I mean, he was encased in adamantium shell. He was dead. Captain America was shot point blank in the chest. That is a lot dead. When you do that, it's a lot different than somebody runs into a building just before it explodes. Okay, well, that's fine. That's easy enough to write around. It's like, oh, well, there was an escape hatch or something, and bring him back that way. Death in comics is a real challenge for me. But again, everything is a big event, so then nothing is. And also, some of my favorite comics ever were small stories. I'm a big Spider-Man fan. There was this great the boy who collected Spider-Man story, which wasn't an action story, it was just Spider-Man visiting a sick kid. And it was awesome. Gosh, not that long ago, I read like a one-page Spider-Man story. I think it was called His Name is Ben, where it just showed these quick clips of Spider-Man saving a pregnant woman, and she wants to name her kid after Spider-Man, and he says, "Well, name him Ben." And then they show all these kids named Ben because they're people that Spider-Man saved. And those are great small stories. Not everything has to be. Too often the stories are Spider-Man getting beat within an inch of his life and barely surviving, and nothing will be the same. I don't like nothing will ever be the same stories unless they are really earned. But those smaller stories, they seem to have less and less space for them because of the new dynamic. You're right. It's a weird time to be a comic book fan because comics themselves are harder to follow because they're constant renumbering and rebooting, and there's so many. When I was reading comics, there was 3 Spider-Man series. That was it. And now it feels like there's just so many and he's in so many other teams and so many team-up books and everything. It's like it's so much harder to keep track of, and everything's so big, you never have that chance to, those sort of in-between moments where this sometimes comic books work best when the stakes aren't that high.
Well, yeah, because one of the wonderful things about, both this medium and this genre is the ability to tell those long form storylines, right? I mean, I mentioned X-Men before, and people always go back to the Claremont run of X-Men because it's, 16 years worth of stories telling a complex, emotional, story over that whole period of time. And the ways that really hooks you as a reader, I don't think we're going to see something like that again in this genre and this medium because that's just not how the market works anymore, and it hasn't for a very long time, but sort of seems to be becoming less and less likely all the time. I mean, just sticking to the example of X-Men again, all the new releases. So they've been going through these kind of like eras that are like branded for the purpose of kind of trade paperbacks. It's like Dawn of X and now it's Fall of X. And all of the Fall of X books are announced as limited series. None of them are being announced as ongoings. It's all like 1 to 5, which is great for a trade paperback republishing, right? And so in some ways that's good because maybe they'll have more chance of selling that to bookstores and libraries. I mean, I was in my local library recently and they had a bunch of the Dawn of X trades all there on the shelf. And for someone that just wants to pick up some X-Men comics, I think that probably looks pretty attractive, far more attractive than picking up, issue number 338 or whatever. But at the same time, yeah, you lose some of that investment in the long-running, ongoing serialized story that for many people who read these things over a long period of time and have had that experience, that was a real draw of this space. So, and in terms of talking about long-lasting emotional relationships with some real complexity and depth to them, which includes good romantic relationships, it's sometimes hard to do that in the current publishing climate, and maybe is becoming even harder.
And X-Men is really interesting with those big relationships because they have a handful, probably the biggest romantic relationship that goes pretty pretty into the original run of X-Men is Cyclops and Jean Grey, who pretty consistently been together. They've had their, obviously the time when Jean Grey was assumed dead, yeah, oh yeah, it's pretty bad in the comics when the writers even wink at that as like, "Oh, Jane's dead." He's like, "Yeah, she's dead for how long?" Like the characters even know eventually she's going to come back.
Well, at least that's part of her power, though. She's the Phoenix. She's supposed to come back, so that's okay. Oh, she gets a pass.
You also have Kitty Pryde and Colossus, and Rogue and oh my god, Gambit.
And Gambit. And you also, though it was coded for a long time, but is now on the page in canonical, Mystique and Destiny, who chronologically have been together longer than anybody.
That was a neat, and you just addressed this stuff. It was queer coded. There was a lot of hints, but in the 80s and 90s, gay characters were not allowed to really exist in comics. They did a lot of, oh, my oldest friend, and it's like, yeah, friend, right. Now, you're big, and it's been addressed many times. I was actually wearing my Nightcrawler shirt that you made a couple days ago. Now, Nightcrawler, he's had a little bit of an interesting thing where he's definitely presented as a romantic character, but doesn't really have that big relationship other than the girl who was his adopted sister for a period of time, and it got kind of weird.
Yeah, I mean, there's been various attempts to give him that kind of character. It is funny how this is a character who has had this has happened to him multiple times. He's had like at least 3 girlfriends who were space mercenaries who dated him for a while and then went off to be space mercenaries again. Which is very fun. That's like the superhero version of like well, I shouldn't say this because I am someone's girlfriend in Canada, but it's the superhero version of, oh, I've got a girlfriend in Canada, but we can't call her or see her ever. But trust me, she exists. She's just in space. I totally have a girlfriend, but she's in space for nebulous reasons and can't ever come back again. Very funny. Comics.
Comics. Is it just because Nightcrawler, who's such a cool character, but he hasn't had his own series very often? Obviously, when he was with the X-Men, a lot of that time was the Claremont Byrne era. And by that point, it was obvious that Wolverine became the breakout character. Claremont showed a lot of affection for Aurora and Kitty Pryde. There was only so much space in each book to give to Kurt that they didn't have. They didn't have enough time to give him that proper relationship. And then when he went over to Excalibur, a lot of it was creating the love triangle with him, Megan, and Captain Britain, where it was obvious that sort of the plan was create some tension there, but Megan was always going to end up with Captain Britain. Do you have thoughts on like why they have a tough time like finding that character? Obviously, many characters don't have that. Oh, she's the one for him. But it feels like because he's such a romantic character, and because they obviously like having him date, that they can't find that one for him.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, as you said, a lot of characters don't have that. I mean, in that character's early history, he was often used in kind of the context of sex bar stories. I mean, his co-creator Dave Cockrum liked using him in that context, and that carried over into Excalibur a little bit, which, that context is all about sort of swashbuckling and sexual flirtation and that kind of thing. And even the relationship that he has with his foster sister witch girlfriend, Amanda Sefton, has sort of the markings of an open relationship a lot of the time. They sort of come in and out of each other's lives, and there's some suggestion that maybe they sort of hook up for sex, but they're not together because Kurt's with other people in the meantime. So, I mean, I don't know. People ask me a lot about that question about like, well, what's your one true pairing for Nightcrawler? And I'm like, well, I mean, Wolverine maybe, but I kind of don't think we're going to get that. So maybe not that. But, maybe he just hasn't met the right person yet. Maybe they're still out there for him.
Well, Wolverine's another character sort of similar where you have the unrequited... They love Wolverine having unrequited feelings for someone. Be it Jean Grey or Heather Hudson from Alpha Flight. They hinted around about that. Mariko?
Tragic Mariko love affair. Oh, why did he always have to kill his girlfriends? Why?
Yeah, they kill a lot of his girlfriends. They've never really... I guess you could say that like the one character for him is this unrequited thing for Jean Grey, which got a little boring for me. But he is sort of at it... For some reason, Wolverine's at his best and I think most relatable either when he has sort of the father figure relationships like he had with Jubilee, Kitty Pryde, or having like him hang out and drinking beers with the characters that he's friends with, like Nightcrawler, and in more recent years he sort of has a neat dynamic with Peter Parker. And you could even see it in the movies. Like they had they couldn't really find a relationship that worked for him in the movies other than him just pining and like flirting with Jean Grey. And then she goes off with Cyclops or he kills her.
I mean, it speaks to what a romantic relationship does within the context of that type of narrative, right? Because for Wolverine, his conflicts being very much sort of Western genre, as in, cowboys and Indians Western genre trope of, domesticity versus the frontier. So he often gets sort of tempted by domesticity, which is represented through romantic relationships. And then the masculine tragedy of that character is always the fall back into violence and isolation. So his romantic relationships often function within that symbology. So that's what you see coming up again and again with Wolverine. Sort of the way that character works is that his romances have to be tragic because those are the central conflicts of the character that they're going to restate forever and ever and ever, because this is a character that, like all long-running popular serialized character, is always going to have to sort of revert to his defining conflicts, because characters can move forward and then they got to backslide because we got to tell more stories with those characters. But they tried to do an interesting thing at the beginning of the Krakoa era of X-Men comics of suggesting that Cyclops and Jean Grey and Wolverine were in a polyamorous relationship. They haven't done a lot on panel in terms of that. It sort of was coding rather than explicit, but still, in theory, that was an interesting way to resolve that while still giving the woman at the center of that sort of relationship a chance to freely exercise her desires as well, and not just be a bargaining chip between the desires of these men.
I remember that they showed like a blueprint for the living quarters for the X-Men, and Wolverine's room had a door to Jean and Scott's room. And then they even had like and what you're talking about on Twitter, they kept showing a panel of Wolverine and Cyclops sort of having a buddy conversation that was sort of a little flirtatious between the two of them.
A little flirty, yeah. That's sort of as far as they've gone with that, but certainly interesting to see them go in that direction.
As we are talking, they have not announced if there's going to be another season of Superman and Lois.
It hangs in the balance, I believe.
And it sort of shows how, and it's a pretty accurate reflection of where the Superman and Lois characters are in the comics, where they've leaned into the marriage, and they actually undid the marriage during the New 52 for a period of time, where it was a different Superman who wasn't involved with the Lois Lane, and they even had the period of time where he was romantically involved with Wonder Woman. They sort of reestablished the marriage. They have a son who, and of course, his comics, he seems to be getting older every day, and people sort of, and I think it's sort of becoming a well-liked run of Superman that we're in the middle of right now. I think there's too many super characters, but that show was sort of doing an interesting thing where they have teenage sons who are dealing with their powers, and all Superman is still Superman, but you have the father figure and him being a father figure, and also Lois, sort of an interesting thing where she's a mom dealing with a superpowered son, and also a son who isn't, and I believe the other son is on the spectrum in the show and dealing with a lot of interesting plot lines. And it's sort of leaning into more of an adult show, or giving them more adult problems. It seems like a pretty good way to go about this, other than just finding another weird way to undo the marriage, which so many other... They undid the marriage between Vision and Scarlet Witch, where they basically erased Vision's personality. They deal with the devil for Spider-Man. Do you think that's a good way to go forward? Do you think that's sustainable, both for Superman and Lois and just characters in general?
I mean, I'm very interested by Superman and Lois. I mean, I mentioned Lois and Clark, the 90s television show a little bit earlier in our conversation, but it's really interesting to me to see them lean into having domesticity at the center of the plot for those characters. I mean, in Superman's history, for a very long time, it was considered impossible to write that story. And I mean, there's a famous essay by Umberto Eco called The Death of Superman that talks about how Superman can't age and change and grow. And there's a lot of stuff that's dated about that essay because that was sort of written before the period of serialized storytelling. But at the same time, with how long these characters have been around and all the reboots of the universes and stuff, it's still pretty relevant. And with Superman, it was always a question of if he had to quote unquote settle down with Lois. And I mean, think about the way we think about domesticity with that kind of terminology, right? If he had to settle down with Lois, he couldn't be Superman anymore. And it comes up in the movies as well, right? Like think about Superman 2, where if he wants to have sex with Lois and like marry her, I guess, but mostly have sex with her, he has to give up his superpowers, right? So, I mean, losing his virginity to Lois Lane almost results in the destruction of the world because he's not Superman anymore and he has to get the powers back and not be with Lois anymore. And that's really a powerful, and I don't mean good powerful, but certainly powerful message about the supposed dangers of domesticity. And associated with that is kind of the feminization of the male character, right? I mean, there's a scene from that film where he gets beaten up by a guy at a bar when he doesn't have his superpowers, right? Because he's become, an emasculated wimp because he chose Lois over being Superman, right? And this is clearly presented as a bad choice, even though it's also played for tragedy. And that's often been how superhero relationships are done, right? It's almost like the threat of domesticity, because if they get seduced by that threat, if they fall victim to that threat, then they won't be able to be a superhero anymore. And even in the Lois and Clark television show from the 90s, they sort of played a slow game in terms of getting those characters together, a lot of that silly love triangle stuff. And the ratings for the show tanked after the characters got married. And so there was a lot of speculation that, the will they and won't they tension not being there anymore is the reason the show tanked. I think it's far more complicated than that. It has like a lot to do with the types of stories they chose to tell with those characters once they were married. I mean, as someone who's watched that show many times and was annoyed by this when she was a young girl as well, as soon as the characters got married, they made the relationship much more sort of traditionally domestic, with Lois sort of giving up some of her professional responsibilities. She's worried about cooking. She gives up her big city apartment. They move into the suburbs with a white picket fence. She spends a lot of time worrying about getting pregnant, and just a very sort of gender normative narrative that I think was quite different than the earlier parts of the show, where she was the strong career woman and they seemed more equal, which is funny because, I mean, that happened after the characters got married, and you'd think that would bring them closer together, but it just seemed to fall into kind of sitcom territory. And Superman and Lois is really interesting the way it's kind of continued that story of Lois and Clark. Like at the end of the Lois and Clark television show, a baby is left on their doorstep and you don't know where it came from, but you never see them raising that child, right? So to have this show from this era that does show them raising their children and maintaining their relationship and their personalities, and he still gets to be a superhero, I think that does say a lot about the ways that our thinking about this space and this genre has matured in some ways, and the audience's receptiveness to that. I mean, I don't want to lead too much into it not getting renewed because there's a lot of shakeup going on in the CW right now, and they're canceling a lot of things across the board. But still, it's been interesting to me as someone who has thought a lot about that Superman and Lois relationship over the years, to see this take on it and see them really embracing domesticity, but as a positive and not as a threat, which in a lot of ways is progress, just given the negative associations with kind of those kind of storylines in years past.
Well, they love telling stories about why shows fall apart.
Yeah.
And finding these quote unquote simple reasons is like moonlighting. Moonlighting fell apart because they got the two characters together. So it wasn't because they got the main characters together. It was because the show was falling apart behind the scenes, and they stopped. And they weren't coming out with new episodes in a timely manner, and the actors hated each other behind the scenes, and that show was falling apart. I remember the show Felicity. where they kept saying that the ratings tanked because they cut the main character's hair. It's like, no, they moved the time. They changed the night that they were showing the program, and it had like much more challenging competition, and it got walloped in the ratings. Superman and Lois, it was a really nifty idea because it was the first time telling a Superman story on big screen or small screen where Clark Kent was a good-looking guy. You got away from Lois having no interest in Superman. I mean, Lois having no interest in Clark and only having eyes for Superman. Instead, they were both viable. They were both viable romantic interests for her. The problem is, it was a great idea. The special effects weren't great. Dean Cain, really good-looking guy. Not the best actor in the world.
She carried that show. Terry Hatcher carried that show.
And it's a reminder of how great Christopher Reeves was as Superman. He was just so good. And so his Clark and his Superman and the way he would carry himself different ways, and felt like different characters, even though it's still obviously Christopher Reeves. And he was a great actor. Dean Cain was just a really handsome guy who looked pretty good in who looked good both as Superman, and he looked good in the thick frame glasses and like the well-tailored shirt and tie. They had only so much budget. Eventually just ran out of steam. It didn't really have. How long did that show run? Did it run 4 seasons? That's back when you did 22 episodes a season. That's a lot to ask of those actors with that budget, with that concept. Obviously, if it's done today, you could get more for your money, and you could even do shorter seasons and have more success.
It's often a chicken and egg thing with this kind of thing, because it's like, well, did a show tank because you got rid of the will they won't they tension, or did you get rid of the will they won't they tension because the show was already tanking, so you did that for the hopes of a ratings boost, and then the show tanked anyway? Because I think that the Moonlighting example is very much that.
Well, also, and we've seen it happen with other shows where, and it's the sitcom, they love doing the will they won't they thing, and I just remember when Friends was on, and I'm like, oh my god, Ross and Rachel are in their 30s. This, just grow up and get together or don't, but this is irritating.
Yeah.
Or what was it, the terrible show, Who's the Boss, where it was just years and years of, will they, won't they, once or twice a season where they address the fact that they're actually in love. It's like, aren't you guys adults? And eventually you just get tired of it because it strains believability so much that adult people who are obviously care for each other or presented as obviously care for each other just not doing anything about it. It's like, there's only so much. You only have so many rounds of that before it gets exhausting, and you just tune off because, nothing's going to happen.
But I mean, it's interesting that you use the word adult a number of times there, right? Because, thinking about the reasons that a lot of editors and superhero comics don't like marriage to exist in that space has to do with the presumption of adulthood, right? That if people are going to have relationships or marriages, that makes this genre that, despite the fact that kids almost exclusively do not read this genre anymore of superhero comics, it's still, there's sort of a youthful nostalgia bound up in that genre, and people still want to have that feeling when they read it. And there's this idea that, well, if the characters are acting too adult, that will take the genre too far away from that innocence, that nostalgia that is still a big motivating factor for a lot of people that do consume these texts. I don't know how true that is. I always think that that's a little bit some marketing genius thinking they know what the readers want and maybe not really having their finger on the pulse of it, but that seems to be the logic feeding a lot of these decisions.
In a narrative that's often been presented about the marriage of Peter Parker and Mary Jane was, as soon as we got the characters together, we regretted getting them married, and we were trying to figure out all these different ways to end the marriage, but we didn't want them to get divorced because it would make them seem divorced. But Spider-Man was never more popular as a comic book than when he was married to Mary Jane. And you had some really good writing from David Michelini, among others. And you had artwork by Todd McFarlane when he was at the zenith of his popularity, as well as Eric Larson and Sal Buscema, and you had a bunch of other artists, a handful of artists at sort of the peak of their popularity. You talk about how people don't like the character married. He literally sold like 2 million copies of a comic when he was married. It can work. Married to Mary Jane could work really well, where it gave him somebody who he could. Mary Jane often could function as the eyes of the reader, where when he's fighting the hobgoblin, she could say, "Oh my God, who is this guy?" And Peter could then sort of explain to the reader via talking to Mary Jane these stories, these characters, and there was also could be a fun dynamic between the two of them because she was more successful, more confident, and him trying, and against Peter Parker, who was always sort of down on himself and had no self-esteem. Those stories can work, but it is just a thing of it's just, don't say that you can't make the marriages work. Spider-Man never worked more from at least a issue sold rate than when he was married to her.
Yeah, but it's about maintaining some sort of inertia, and if sales start to slip with a character being married, you got to make them not married so that you can get people hanging on to that tension. Because look at how much discussion it's generated. And at the end of the day, that's kind of what they're looking for. This is a business, right?
Do you have? You already said who when you think of like the most iconic couple. Do you have a favorite comic book couple?
I do have a lot of affection for Vision and Scarlet Witch as a couple, in terms of being a couple that their relationship was really convincing because it was developed over a very long period of time. I mean, there was like 10 years of will they or won't they comics, almost that long anyway. And then there was a lot of interesting symbolism bound up in that relationship of them, being differently different and drawn to each other as strangers in a strange land. And it was kind of a parable at that time about interracial marriage, but these days has a lot of queer connotations too, in terms of the public thinking that their relationship was deviant and wrong, and they actually get attacked by religious fundamentalists and that kind of thing, which again sounds really like gay marriage in a 21st century context, but was more about interracial relationships in the 70s and 80s. But yeah, that's a relationship that I'm always kind of rooting for. Avengers relaunch this week. I reviewed it for Comics XF. Wanda and Vision are back on the team together. Writer Jed MacKay announced that he was on the book by tweeting out a panel from Vision and Wanda's honeymoon. So I got hopes that, given the WandaVision show, there's a new Vision Quest show coming out, Wanda remains a character in the MCU, maybe we're going to see them back on page together at some point. Things seem to be moving in that direction, but I'll believe it when I see it.
For me, it's Hawkeye and Mockingbird, because I really like their I read that original West Coast Avengers series, even though back then I knew it wasn't very good. Al Milgrom, God bless him. He's a better inker, and maybe even with breakdowns, he's pretty good because he can choreograph stuff pretty well, but not a very good artist. And the writing was it was very stereotypical what you think of bad comic book writing as. The dialogue. They were just huge word balloons where they're describing every single thought and emotion and action they're doing.
Love that. Love it.
I did like the dynamic of them, where Hawkeye always presented as like smart, clever, bit of a jerk, and rough around the edges, and you had Mockingbird, who was strategic and sort of refined and sensible, and I thought there was a good dynamic between the two of them. So I always liked that couple, which, again, they go back to every now and then. Is there a comic book couple that maybe didn't last real long, but you sort of liked what they did with that what they did with him. You thought it made some interesting storytelling, like lesser known. Mentioned before that Spider-Man and Mockingbird were together for a period of time. Kitty Pryde, who we always sort of think of is an on again, off again with Colossus, was actually engaged to Star-Lord for a period of time.
Yeah, I know.
Is there one of those lesser known couples that you liked or wanted to see more of?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I wish that I'd had an answer prepared. I mean, you asked me about Nightcrawler before. So, I mean, he had a character, an alien warrior lady called Cerise that was introduced by Alan Davis in the pages of Excalibur. And they had a very brief love affair and have seen each other a couple of times over the years, but nothing has sort of come of that subsequently. I would have liked them to see, I would have liked to have them have a bit more time to play off of each other because there was an interesting dynamic set up of, Nightcrawler kind of likes a big, strong lady and isn't intimidated by that. And they share a very iconic kiss in Excalibur 56, perhaps. I hope I'm getting that issue number right. In which she seizes him and they kiss for 7 entire minutes on page. And he kicks up his leg at the end of it. And very interesting dynamic that I would have liked to see explored a little bit more. But Alan Davis left the book, and then she was revealed as a Shi'ar war criminal and taken away to space jail. And then it was like another 15 years before they saw each other again. So, regrets about that one.
I always liked when they did when Brian Michael Bendis did the Ultimate Spider-Man series. It was obvious that it was telling a story of a teenage Peter and Mary Jane, and they pretty quickly removed Gwen Stacy from the equation. First, she just showed no interest in Peter. They killed her off, and then she wasn't killed. Then later, she revealed not to be killed off, but they never really set up that dynamic. But then Peter and Mary Jane broke up, and I remember it was funny, they sort of had a crossover with Spider-Man and the X-Men, the ultimate versions of, and it showed that Kitty Pryde had a crush on Spider-Man. Not Peter Parker or anything like that, she just had a crush on Spider-Man. I don't know what the thought process was, but it seemed like, they realized, there might be something there, and they had this great annual for Ultimate Spider-Man where they got Peter Parker and Kitty Pryde together. And it was really cute, and I liked, there was an interesting thing where their worlds were so different because Peter Parker had a secret identity. He had to be nerdy and quiet, even though he had spider powers and everything. And Kitty Pryde coming from the world of X-Men and the Xavier Institute, and they just hung out at school. And she's like, well, why don't you just beat him up? They had that romance going on for about a year, and it, pardon the phrase, petered out. And I don't think and Bendis wasn't always great at sticking the landing on stories like that. But I really liked that because it was different. And it was two characters that in the main Marvel universe, you never saw Spider-Man and Shadowcat interact. Because they wouldn't have any reason to. Shadowcat was always presented to be a teenager. By that point, Spider-Man was in his 20s. Spider-Man rarely interacted with X-Men. The team, at least. Every now and then there would be a Marvel team-up or something like that, and he would have team-ups with Wolverine on occasion, but there was never any reason, and it was like, two characters that never realized that there would be some cool chemistry, especially when you have a 15-year-old Peter Parker and a 15-year-old Kitty Pryde. And it's like, it was sort of it was telling where I was disappointed when they split those two characters up and they tried to reestablish the relationship between that version of Peter Parker and Mary Jane. It's like, it's not good that I don't want the characters who are obviously the leads of the series together. It's like, Bendis seemed to be having more fun writing the Peter Shadowcat or Kitty Pryde story than anything else.
Yeah, I think Bendis likes writing Kitty Pryde in general too, so...
Writers love Kitty Pryde.
This is true.
And she's a fine character. I'm not 100% sure. What do you think the appeal...
Oh, this is a big question. We can't get into this at the end of the podcast. I think it has to do with her being literally every fanboy's crush for a certain period of comics, both an identification character and the character that you were supposed to have a crush on. That is centrally the appeal of the character for Joss Whedon, who was very obsessed with her to the point that he based the character of Buffy on her. And that's certainly the appeal for a writer like Bendis as well. She just is the emblematic girl next door that you either want to be or have a crush on, or maybe a little bit of both. And that really appeals to writers who want to write that fantasy, but also in terms of her being a very useful character as an author surrogate, because she's often, again, that point of view character and was very self-consciously written to be one of those characters who could be you in the space of that franchise, right? The young kid who's encountering the X-Men, who's a super genius and then becomes a ninja, and she's very much a wish fulfillment character in a whole variety of ways.
Fine character, hard powers to write. That was pretty deep into Claremont, and has spoken about how he doesn't like point and shoot powers. Kitty Pryde, she can phase, and she can disrupt electronics when she phases through them, which is neat, but you would spend a lot of time trying to write around the fact that she was often, especially in that 80s era, kind of useless in a fight. A weird mix of sort of useless, but then also sort of overpowered, where you would just, I remember the Mutant Massacre, where you had a character, basically shoot a gun right through her head and then try to chop off her head, but she was phased. It's like, well, you can't do anything. She can't do anything to you, so Claremont had to figure out a reason for her to just run away to save Colossus. Claremont was so funny with that, where he would just write powers that could only be used in very specific instances, and he seemed to spend so much time trying to write them into those scenarios.
Yep, superpower logic problems. You either like that about the genre, or you hate that about the genre.
I tell you, it was fine. It was easy to hide in a teen book, because that was always my problem with the Human Torch, where you had a character in a comic book where his powers are setting things on fire, so you would have him battling other characters. Well, he can't just set the bad guys on fire, and there were so many issues of Fantastic Four or whatever series Human Torch would be involved in, where he's either setting Doombots on fire, because you can set robots on fire all the time, or their big battle would be going on, and you would just see Johnny Storm flying in the background, not actually doing anything because they don't know what to do.
It's a question, right? When your superpowers are basically to kill people, how do you exist in the comic without just killing people?
People have a lot of affection in the Avengers comics for Black Knight, and he was so useless because his power was he had a sword that could cut through anything, but he's an Avenger. He's not supposed to kill people anyway. Plus, if he did, there would be if his blade touched blood, he would then become evil and it would take over. And I was like, so basically, you just have so many issues of Avengers. The big battle you would see Black Knight in the background running somewhere with his sword, not doing anything.
Yeah. Good visual, though. They just wanted to draw a knight guy in the midst of these futuristic characters, which, fair.
Completely fair. Black Knight was an interesting character because he was, especially the run of Avengers that I'm thinking of, and probably his longest run with the team, he was a guy who didn't feel he was good enough to be an Avenger. That was always interesting, where at that point, you had Captain America, Scarlet Witch, Hercules, Star Fox, all characters that were either incredibly competent, incredibly powerful, or sort of arrogant. And then you had one guy who's like, well, I'm here with a sword I can't really use, and I'm just sort of a dude otherwise. That works. So, Doc, it's awesome having you back. Thank you so much for having your time. I need you to plug your pluggables. What do you have going on?
Sure. Well, my book, Super Sex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero, just came out in a new, much cheaper paperback edition last month. You can get it, I think, for 40% off right now at the University of Texas website. If you type in Super Sex University of Texas, you'll get to it. I think you can get it for about $25 right now. Super good deal. You can find me at my podcast at I should say the name of my podcast. You can find me at my podcast, which is called the Oh Gosh, Oh Golly, Oh Wow podcast. It is a podcast about the classic Marvel series Excalibur. Every single issue, every single week, We have wonderful guests, including Brad on one of our very early episodes, talking through all the shenanigans of that series. We're almost at issue 100 in our read-along at this point. And you can also find me sometimes at the website Comics XF, doing comic book reviews, and you can find me at the Twitter account Sequential Scholars, where we do scholarly threads about comic books, me and my colleague Andrew DeMann. Currently, we are talking about Kate Beaton's graphic novel Ducks, at least for the next few days, probably at the time that this episode comes out. And, just look me up personally on Twitter too, Peppard_Anna. Real boring. I'm usually tweeting about some sort of comics nonsense there.
Well, Doc, it's awesome to have you back. We're gonna do this again. As we've talked about, we're slowly working our way to the wrapping up the Cosmic Geppetto podcast. Episode 300 is going to be our final episode. But we're going to work to get you back at least one more time. So thank you so much.
Love to celebrate your 300th episode with you, Brad. Thanks so much for having me again.
That wraps episode 280. Big thanks to Dr. Anna Peppard. It has been a while since she was last on, and she never disappoints. Also, big thanks to Katie. Her questions are always the best. Next time on the Cosmic Geppetto podcast, Tim Burdick returns to talk about the music supergroup Boy Genius. Till then, in the words of Jarv Hart,
see you in the funny pages.
Subscribe to the Cosmic Geppetto podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever quality podcasts can be found. Rate and review us while there. Follow us on Twitter at CosmicGPod, and we will follow you back. Unless you're a jerk. We don't follow jerks. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cosmic Geppetto. We love hearing your ideas for upcoming episodes. Email us at cosmicgeppetto@comcast.net.
I shouldn't say this because I am someone's girlfriend in Canada, but it's the superhero version of, I've got a girlfriend in Canada.